Westminster, Washington, the world. We've got it covered. Now on BBC Two, a new week of Politics Live.
It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Shadow Scotland Secretary Ian Murray MP, Conservative MP and former Hillary Clinton aide Laura Farris, Helen Lewis of The Atlantic and Telegraph columnist Madeline Grant.
I pledge to be a president who seeks not to divide, but unify.
US President-elect Joe Biden promises to unite his nation. But what does he mean for the UK?
There is far more that unites the government of this country and government in Washington any time, at any stage, than divides us.
There is no way that Britain can afford to fall out with the United States of America and then fall out, obviously, with the European Union.
Are you optimistic, Mr. Barnier?
The EU's chief negotiator arrives in London. What will events on the other side of the Atlantic mean for a deal? Wales ends its firebreak and begins to open up, but what impact are lockdowns having on our mental health? We start the programme with some breaking news. Let me just show you this tweet from the BBC's medical editor Fergus Walsh. A coronavirus vaccine developed by Pfizer and BioNTech is 90% effective in preventing COVID-19. Both those companies have announced. He also tweets a little bit more about some of the detail. He says the devil is in the detail, including how long the protection will last. But this looks highly promising. The UK has advance orders for 30 million doses of the vaccine, which would be enough to immunise 15 million people. So, encouraging news on the vaccine. Ian, what's your reaction?
Well, it's great news, isn't it? Because we've been desperate for some good news. We don't want to get too excited, as Fergus has said in his tweet. It's very early. We might not know whether or not it's effective and for how long. But I think the key thing here now for the UK government is to make sure that they can roll this out. I mean, their testing regime has been pretty appalling over the last 7 or 8 months. And now we need to make sure how the UK government has a plan post-COVID and post this current lockdown to get these doses to everyone in the country, because that will be the key in terms of rolling out any successful vaccine.
Laura?
Yes, I agree. I think it's hugely welcome news and it has the potential to be transformational. And I think sort of the most important thing is that they've already bought 15 million doses, because
30 million doses, which would be enough to immunise 15 million people.
15 million people, because if you look at the numbers of those who were shielding the vulnerable, the elderly, they've already been identified by the government. We know that because they were all alerted in the first lockdown. And I think the number is 12.5 million people fell into that category. So in principle, there is enough of the vaccine that's already been pre-purchased to begin that rollout very readily.
Right. And would you take it?
I would.
Yes, and you, Ian?
I think I would.
Yes, at 90, well, more than 90% effective, I think we're hearing. We can talk to the BBC's health correspondent, Michelle Roberts. Michelle, can you give us any more detail in terms of the effectiveness, first of all, of this vaccine?
So this is a trial that's been going on with thousands of people. So more than nearly 44,000 people have been taking part in the trial. Now, the results are on some of those. They've not got to the very end of that trial yet, but it's looking really positive. So they compare the vaccine with a placebo, a dummy jab, and then see how many people in each arm get infected with COVID, and it shows that the ones who received the real vaccine were protected. It seemed to be over 90% effective at offering protection, which is really positive. Now, what we need to know now is once we get the full data, is it still looking like that, which hopefully it will do? Also, what's the safety profile like, which so far has been really good, but again, we just need confirmation that it is safe as well as effective, and then that it can be manufactured to a standard that regulators are happy with. Now, we're expecting in the next few weeks to get answers to all of those things, which could mean that the vaccine would be out before Christmas for a limited number of people. We know that the UK government has ordered 30 million doses of this vaccine, pre-ordered it, so hopefully it could get out there quite soon.
Right, yes. Can I just ask a bit more about the timing? You say that could actually start to be rolled out then in terms of distribution before Christmas?
Yeah, so the manufacturers are hoping to apply for an emergency authorisation. So it's not the normal route that people would go with drugs that we see developed all the time, but this is exceptional circumstances for a disease that's so important at the moment. If they can get that approval from regulators, they'd need approval in the US and also in the EU, then they could start to give the vaccine outside of a clinical trial. Now, the first people who might get a dose are those most at risk, so elderly, frail people, healthcare workers on the front line of this pandemic.
Thank you very much. Encouraging news there on a COVID-19 vaccine. And, of course, we'll bring you any more detail as we get it over the coming days. We're going to move on to the US election. And, in fact, the news, obviously, from the President-elect Joe Biden in his speech that he wants to unify a very divided country, but also the impact that it could have on relations here between the UK and the US and a possible trade deal. Helen, first of all, what do you think? Can Joe Biden and will Joe Biden be a good thing for Britain?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there is any US president that wants to have a bad relationship with Britain. I think the difficult thing is really that there are problematic tweets and statements on both sides. So the Vote Leave kind of caucus within Downing Street are still very annoyed about Barack Obama's intervention in the Brexit debate when he said the UK would be at the back of the queue, and he deliberately used queue rather than line in order to rub that point home. So there is soreness there. And then on the other side, there is, for example, Boris Johnson's remark that Barack Obama removed the bust of Churchill from the White House because of a half Kenyan ancestral dislike for Britain, something which unfortunately that quite a lot of people around Biden and Obama considered to be racist. So there is a problem starting from the fact there's mutual distrust on both sides, but equally well, there are compelling reasons, particularly related to security, for the two countries to work together. So diplomacy, always happens at the level of personal interactions, but also cold, hard realizations of what's best for each country. I don't think you'll see a particularly warm relationship between the two sides, but you will see a functioning one.
Do you think, Laura, that Boris Johnson now regrets some of his past statements? Now we have Joe Biden as president-elect.
I think that there is a sort of an important moment for Boris Johnson to set his own relationship with Joe Biden. I understand they haven't met before. And Joe Biden is an experienced politician with nearly 50 years in Washington. This is a high-stakes, very special relationship. I don't think a few throwaway remarks said 4 or 5 years ago are going to have any bearing at all on the capacity to have a very strong personal relationship as well as a political relationship.
But you know how important those diplomatic relations are, and we did see something of a rush to reach out to the Biden team in the sort of closing weeks of the campaign by the UK government. Do you think there is a sense of mutual mistrust both here and there in terms of Brexit?
No, I don't get that sense at all. And actually, all the senior Democrats I've heard from have given the impression they consider Brexit to be a settled matter, a domestic issue, just as we sort of respected the US election in that process. And I think one of the things that's been touched on is the areas of commonality in terms of policy. And when you probe that, actually, it's hard to find any key issue of international policy on which we're not agreed with the United States.
Ian?
Well, Boris Johnson as a Prime Minister is very much in the mould of Donald Trump. He's overpromised and underdelivered. He's tried to divide the country. And I think what President-elect Biden has done in his speeches this week is very clearly said it's about bringing the country together. It doesn't matter from your red state or a blue state. It's about bringing Americans together. And I think the Prime Minister should take a lesson from that and try and bring the country together. But don't forget that Biden's very much rooted in Ireland. He is very proud of his Irish roots. The breaking of the law and the internal market bill will be looked on very severely by any future administration from Joe Biden. So there's a lot of bridges to be built here, and the first bridge that could be built would be to not break international law.
If I could just come back on that. to say, I mean, Joe Biden has made very strong unifying remarks in all his opening speeches, but to say that Boris Johnson hasn't is completely inconsistent with the way that he won the election last year and the way he's governed. The whole language of levelling up, which isn't just a vague idea, it saw material results in the way he was able to eat into the red wall in terms of electoral results.
But when Donald Trump ever had a problem presented to him by the American people, he waved the stars and stripes and put on his cap that said, "Make America Great Again." And the public, and particularly those blue states that have been flipped to blue states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, have seen through that now. And I think
he did get a lot of votes, though, still, didn't he, Donald?
He certainly did get a lot of votes. But what the Prime Minister now needs to do in terms of post-Brexit Britain is to try and heal some of those divides as well. And you can't heal those divides by promising oven-ready deals that was quite clearly never going to happen with the EU and then going back on them.
Right, well, Madeline, I mean, does a Joe Biden victory make a US-UK trade deal, something that Boris Johnson wants very much, more or less likely?
Yeah, I think it makes it the chance of expediting one quickly less likely in the short term. Sure. I mean, clearly Biden doesn't have the same kind of personal love of Britain, the same kind of personal affinity with Brexit that Donald Trump did, for all his faults. But I do think that we're falling into a bit of a trap here, where we're trying to kind of impose a British narrative onto the US election and infer divisions there that don't necessarily exist. It's very interesting that, for example, there's been so much discussion about these isolated tweets by Obama-era advisors. And yet over the weekend, Andrew Marr spoke to Senator Chris Coons, who is actually a key ally of Biden and might very well become his Secretary of State. And he took a far more nuanced and complimentary view of the Prime Minister. And he even went out of his way to criticise US commentators who haven't done their homework. And I think part of the reason that we're trying to impose this narrative is that it suits certainly the left in Britain to try to claim that Boris Johnson is a kind of tin pot Trump figure. But actually, beyond the support for Brexit and, I guess, the slightly wild hair, I'm not convinced the analogy goes that far. You know, I think on social issues, climate change, all kinds of... Boris Johnson adopts a much more liberal line on many, many issues than Donald Trump. He broadly favours the multilateral alliances. Trump doesn't. I'm not sure that the shoe fits, but it does suit the left to kind of pretend that it does.
Helen?
I think there's a reasonable point to what Madeline's saying there, which is that there is very obviously a big qualitative difference between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, and some of the comparisons between the two of them have been lazy. But I do think that the thing that we need to understate is underneath that diplomatic language, this is frosty. You know, very deliberately briefings are being put out that Biden is going to phone Macron in France and Merkel in Germany before Britain. You know, there is a snub is being delivered quite consciously. And as with all things in diplomacy, it's trying to work out whether or not that is, you know, that's the air war, that's just to make sure that we know that we're being snubbed, or whether or not it leads to anything serious in policy terms. I think the other thing I would say is that I don't think it necessarily has to be that Joe Biden's desperate to diss us. He's just got a lot on. And why would a US-UK trade deal be at the top of that? You know, he's a man essentially walking into a burning building with one small bucket. And I don't know why doing Britain any favours would really be at the top of his in tray.
Well, that may be the case, of course, Helen. I mean, one of the things that may be a sort of prevent a US-UK trade deal coming around the corner or anytime quickly is this. Joe Biden tweeted in September, in response to clauses in the UK's internal market bill, we cannot allow the Good Friday Agreement that brought peace to Northern Ireland to become a casualty of Brexit. Any trade deal between the US and UK must be contingent upon respect for the agreement and preventing the return of a hard border, period. Laura?
Well, yes. Of course, that was his intervention in September, but I think the point of the United Kingdom Internal Markets Bill is to prevent a return to a hard border. It's to maintain the integrity of the United Kingdom. And actually, I think it was in some ways overstated, his tweet, because Brian Mulvaney, who was Donald Trump's representative in Northern Ireland, said substantively similar things. But there is no intention by the British government, in fact, the opposite applies, to see any damage to the Good Friday Agreement or a return to the hard border.
Right. But of course, the idea is that there's contradiction at the very heart of those clauses in the Internal Market Bill and the Northern Ireland Protocol. What do you say in response?
Well, this is a piece of legislation that's been on the statute book just since the 19th of December of last year and has been reversed by the UK government in the space of a few months, because the oven-ready deal that was put in place, that was promised by the Prime Minister, hasn't been and can't be delivered. And what Joe Biden has done there is just highlighted the fact that the Americans will not see any undermining of the Good Friday Agreement. We've become, as Charlie Faulkner, I think, said on BBC this morning, an international pariah in terms of international law. So the government really have to take a step back. And can I just mention about Gordon Brown in the clip there? He's absolutely right. We can't be falling out with the EU and the US. They're two incredibly important allies in a post-Brexit Britain. We need a deal with the EU, we need a deal with the US, and the diplomacy has to be geared towards that.
Laura?
Well, I think that the United Kingdom Internal Markets Bill was the provisions about overriding international law are only conditional if the EU seeks to divide the territories of the United Kingdom. So nothing's happened in that regard yet. And I think in terms of us falling out with the US and also falling out with the EU or not securing a free trade agreement, what you see now is that Michel Barnier and David Frost have basically gone into the negotiating tunnel. All the mood music has changed. This period of intensive talks is ongoing.
The mood music's changed in what way?
Well, I think there was a period in September where there were quite sort of tense messaging coming out on both sides. There were some tweets and that has all changed. The language has changed. Michel Barnier is here, as you showed at the top of your piece. And, at one point, the middle of October was presented as a deadline, but that isn't the case, that the talks are ongoing.
Right, well, let's talk, though, about these law-breaking clauses, as critics of it have called it, Madeline, because, Joe Biden's made it clear they'll be a deal-breaker as far as they're concerned.
Yeah, and I think, despite Brandon Lewis's assurances at the time that this would only be breaking the law in a limited and specific way, this was incredibly controversial within the Conservative Party too. It was sparking a great backlash even amongst ardent Brexiteers in the Tory party, like the former Attorney General Geoffrey Cox. So I think it was always likely that this would continue to reverberate. And of course, as you say, the stakes are much higher now with the election of Joe Biden.
Right, but in the Lords today, peers are going to probably remove those contentious clauses in the bill relating to the Northern Ireland Protocol. What will the government do in response, Laura? Will they bend in the end and just let those clauses melt away?
Well, I think we've seen one response from the government over the weekend, and they said that they wouldn't do that. But I think we have to wait and see how it plays out in the Lords today and in the days ahead.
Right, Helen, will that put a pressure on the government?
Well, I think what you see is the choreography is very interesting, because those clauses are essentially being presented as a safety net, and you don't need a safety net unless you're walking out over the cliff edge, right?
Yeah.
So what could happen is these very intensive 10 days of talk now could come back with a deal, at which point the government can quietly shelve those clauses as if they're not needed. I mean, it all speaks to the bigger choice that's in front of Boris Johnson now, and it is a big political choice. It's whether or not make some concessions, get a deal, face the fury of your backbenchers who, really wanted you to be, to stand up to Europe and send a strong message, versus do you go for no deal with the economic disruption that brings in the middle of a pandemic, but, you get the full-bore Brexit that you always talked about. And, the other is also compounded by the fact of what makes Brexit go away. I mean, I think, the last election was won on get Brexit done. And actually, no deal doesn't get Brexit done. It makes Brexit limp on with endless sticking plasters over bits of emergency legislation here and there. And that's surely got to factor into Boris Johnson's choice as well.
Laura, will Boris Johnson stick to that commitment of no deal if they can't reach an agreement?
He will stick to that commitment, but I have to say I do think that that there is a collective will on both sides of the argument now to get there, and you see that by the presence of Michel Barnier in London today.
Right. I mean, Ian, Madeline raised this issue about whether the sort of dynamic changes. Now Joe Biden is the president-elect, and as you say, feels very strongly about his Irish roots, and he made that tweet earlier in the year. Will it have an impact on the EU negotiations? Will the EU and Michel Barnier feel actually a little more emboldened?
Well, I think it emboldens the arguments about breaking international law, and I do agree with the panel this afternoon, but we're talking about the minutiae of the UK Internal Markets Bill. The message that the UK government has sent out to the international community is we are willing to break international law, despite the fact that we've promised an oven-ready deal, despite the fact we promised the easiest deal in trade history. It's not going to be that. Now, perhaps both sides could perhaps put Twitter away for a few weeks while they're negotiating this. But the EU will be slightly emboldened by that because they know that breaking international law is a really bad thing to do. They were very angry about it. And if President-elect Biden is saying, well, I will not countenance anything that undermines the Good Friday Agreement, then the UK government will have to move on those provisions.
Right, Madeline, do you think so? As you said, Joe Biden is a man in favour of multilateral organisations. Trump was a disruptor who was more of a fan of Brexit. Will that help the negotiations between the EU and the UK or not?
I'm not sure that it will materially affect it all that much. I think it certainly does change the dynamic a little bit. But I think, regardless of the outcome of the election, there would have been great incentives on both sides for them to reach a deal. The other thing that I think we do sometimes lose sight of slightly in all of the kind of smoke and mirrors of this period of the process is that this kind of brinksmanship is common to every EU negotiation going back for years. Last-minute deals are entirely par for the course. And I think we still haven't had a good reason to believe that the same won't happen this time. It's significant that despite all of these loud threats on both sides to pull the plug, they are, after all, still speaking to each other, and the talks are still ongoing. And there's even talk of finding, a creative way around the current deadlines and a possible extension.
Right, Laura, we said that you were an aide to Hillary Clinton. Can you give us a sense of how the US really regards the UK? I mean, Helen said it just won't be at the top of his list of priorities, Joe Biden, in terms of a deal. What is it like? Do they not really regard us as important in the way we think they do?
Well, I worked for Hillary when she was in the Senate and her daughter had recently left Oxford. I don't think that affected anything, but I got the impression of an incredibly close relationship and a keen interest in Northern Ireland. They were very aware of their role as sort of the peace brokers in that, and I remember she referred to it several times in conversations I had with her. But the idea that we, I think, aggrandised that relationship wasn't borne out by my experience. I felt that there was a genuine sort of closeness. And at that time, of course, there was which is, I think, a precedent for this relationship, Tony Blair and George Walker Bush had an incredibly close relationship, despite the fact their domestic policy positions were different and their domestic political parties were different. And then the same was played out with David Cameron and Barack Obama. So there's always been room for more sort of nuance and collaboration between the US and the UK, and part of that is a function of the special relationship.
Helen?
Well, I think we think that America thinks about us a lot more than America thinks about us. And since going to work for an American publication in the Atlantic, I'm afraid I've come even more to that conclusion. I think there's a broad awareness of Britain. They like Downton Abbey and the Great British Baking Show, as they've, for reasons I don't understand, renamed it. But, we're just not a priority. America is a big country with lots and lots of problems. And actually we are, in their list of priorities quite a long way down after, big foreign policy questions such as what to do about China and Russia. So sometimes I think British politicos can sort of see America as like the big proper stage, like what you graduate to. We get very excited about the West Wing and people, you see British political aides go to the Oval Office and have their photo taken in it, like they can't believe that they're finally there in proper politics. And so I think that, it's just worth reminding ourselves that we think about America a lot more than America thinks about us.
Well, on the flip side, we can show you this tweet from the American network ABC News in terms of whether they think we think about them all the time. Fireworks lit up the night sky over London, England, after Joe Biden was characterised to be the apparent winner of the presidential election. It was, of course, November the 5th and fireworks night. Do you think it works both ways?
Well, if ABC News want to portray it that way, we should take that, and that should maybe build some of the special relationship. But on those issues, there is a very close political dialogue between the UK and the US, but also there's a very close people dialogue, because wherever you go in the United States, they're very keen to talk about their roots in Scotland and Ireland and England and the migration. They feel very, very close to their traditional ancestry as well. So there is a very close relationship between the people of the UK and America. I don't think we should forget that.
Right, but also for centre-left parties, for the Labour Party here, we've already had Sir Keir Starmer saying the US election result was a lesson for the Labour Party in coalition building. You're talking about the same sort of things. And no doubt you will be buoyed to some extent by the Democrats winning, and you are hoping to build back a coalition to power. But that's impossible, isn't it, for Labour, really, without any more seats in Scotland?
Well, it is incredibly difficult mathematically and also politically, but it's something we need to take lessons from in America. And I mentioned Pennsylvania, Wisconsin and Michigan earlier because they were certainly the key states that Trump was able to flip on this promise of a Make America Great Again, wrapping it in the American flag. That's essentially what's happened in Scotland. It's been wrapped in the saltire. Nationalism and that whole debate about the Constitution has paralysed Scottish politics. And it's up to centre-left parties like the Labour Party to get the debate back to the issues that really matter.
And you failed to do that, haven't you? I mean, you've been the only Labour MP in Scotland since 2015, after Labour dominating Scottish politics for, 25 to 30 years or so. What do you do?
Well, what I do in South Edinburgh, if I can go to that very procreal issue, is to build that broad coalition that you're talking about. And it's about speaking to people, it's about understanding their issues. But if I can just reflect on this very show at the tail end of last week, when you had Andrew Neil versus Alan Smith, the SNP MP for Stirling, and Andrew Neil was very clear. Poverty in some parts of Glasgow is worse than some parts of sub-Saharan Africa.
So why hasn't Labour benefited?
Well, we need to get off of these issues. Constitution. We need to be starting to talk about the issues that are right at the forefront of people's ideas and people's views. And all the polling shows that. The NHS, education, the economy is right at the top of what Scots want to talk about and the issues that are important to them. Independence barely makes it into the top 10. It's up for us as a party to be talking and listening to people to find out what their ideas and what they want from the Scottish
So more listening to be done.
Well, there's a lot more listening to be done, but we have to break through this paralysis of the Constitution, and until we do that, it's going to be incredibly difficult for anybody else to be heard.
All right, we'll leave it there for the moment. We're going to go back to coronavirus because the pandemic has been an anxious time for all of us, not least children. Here's Jack Fenwick.
I was a bit nervous about school and I didn't want to go at first.
We're in a mental health crisis and I think early intervention is key.
Children who aren't supported early on grow into adults who have mental health issues.
If you've got a mini beast inside, what do you do with it? Yeah.
With children missing out on months of school because of the pandemic, it's easy to focus on how they can catch up academically. But some educational charities are calling on schools to prioritise mental health and well-being instead.
Some of our children didn't come to school from March onwards, so when they came back on the 1st of September, they hadn't been in school for 2 terms. We really thought about what provision we put in place for those children, and we came completely off curriculum for the first 2 weeks, and it was all about getting them back into school.
One of the methods used here at Intact Primary is outdoor learning.
That is very muddy.
My birthday was like a month ago, on the 22nd, but and every year I invite like a couple of friends, but this year I couldn't.
Oh, really?
It's really sad.
Yeah. So why is it fun being outside then?
Because I get to run around and forget all the bad things.
Oh, well, that's nice. What have you found there?
A worm.
A worm?
Yeah. It's like the first time we're doing this.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I'll just try some gardening.
Yeah? So is it fun getting to do it then?
It's pretty fun.
Yeah. So would you normally be in a classroom then rather than outside?
Yeah.
So is it better being out here?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Because, one, we don't have to do work, and 2, I get to have some fresh air.
Yeah, exactly.
The Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government has named Blackburn as one of the most deprived areas of the UK. And Intact's acting head teacher says that brings extra challenges.
I'm part of the local community group on the estate, and we met last week and talked about just that and how we were going to support our families. And we're finding it very difficult, to offer that support because the parents aren't allowed to come into school and meet with us. So we are looking at ways as a community on how we can support families out there, but it is difficult, isn't it?
What have you found now?
It's a table.
A table? Is that going to go inside there?
Emma Scott delivers pastoral care in the school. She says some pupils have struggled.
We're experiencing children that wouldn't ordinarily have any issues, that are coming worried about things like academic issues. I've had some children that are in year 6 that are already worried about going to high school a year before it's going to happen because they're aware that they've missed out on a big chunk of year 5. We've had children worried about actually catching the virus and passing it on.
While schools like Intact Primary in Blackburn are obviously doing a lot around the idea of children's mental health, it's not happening everywhere. And that's why some are now calling on central government to play a more active role.
We've sent schools a huge amount of additional resources, rolling out the curriculum on the mental health training so that young people can be more aware of how to support themselves and their peers, and also launched a huge cross-the-country wellbeing and education return programme to give schools local support from experts in mental health.
We're going to try now, write the word calm in bubble letters.
Schools are saying that on the whole, children have coped well. But as COVID restrictions tighten around the country, some like Intac are worried that uncertainty and anxiety could get worse.
Jack Fenwick reporting there. I mean, the figures are stark. The most recent figures that have come out, calls to Childline reached nearly 43,000 between March and October. NHS data show a 50% rise in the number of children suffering from anxiety, depression, etc. And 2 in 5 children aged 11 to 16 feel the coronavirus lockdown has made their lives worse. Does the government need to focus more on this, Laura?
I think the government has been very focused on this. There is a reason why all school settings are remaining open through this second lockdown, because it's recognised that it places a disproportionate burden on very young people to keep them in their homes in an isolated way. And I mean, as your video showed, and I've got children at primary school myself, I mean, they benefit hugely from being in their class bubbles with their teachers. Even though it's a slightly artificial way of being at school, it's been absolutely, you know, it's been so critical for the way that they've re-engaged. And I think one of the things I saw in your film just there is that those children who the head said had struggled were obviously doing really well by re-engaging with school and getting part of those sort of outdoor activities. So I think keeping schools open was priority number one. Then, as Vicky Ford said, the wellbeing funding, and also one of the things that didn't get mentioned in your film is the catch-up funding for those children who really missed a lot of school in the summer term and didn't do much.
And can they access that now, schools?
I'm not sure, actually. I do believe it's been rolled out, but what the Prime Minister said in the Chamber last week was that he actually envisaged that looking like one-to-one tutoring for quite a lot of children to really sort of support their catch-up education.
Right, there is, of course, the issue of lockdown, Ian. I mean, even Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, when being questioned by MPs about the necessity of a lockdown because of infection rates, said it will lead to an increase in mental health problems. Is the balance right?
Well, I think we've got a mental health time bomb in this country, not just with children, but in particular children, because, yes, it's great that children are back in school. They should be back in school. I think your video there was fantastic, and what a great job that teacher's doing, and teachers are doing across the country. But there is a time bomb happening here, because kids are very robust, but they're very perceptive. And at home, they're not able to visit grandparents and extended family, do normal swimming lessons, mix with their friends. There might be parents in the household who are worried about jobs, who are worried about, just concerned and anxious about this coronavirus crisis. So we don't really quite know how that's going to affect children, but having them in school is absolutely critical for that process, because it's the only real normality that they have.
If I could just sort of give one corrective to that. There have been a few unusual carve-outs with this lockdown, and the ability to kind of meet someone from another household outside and the household support bubbles. Obviously, they're very limited carve-outs, but they do mean that the kind of isolation that some people experienced in the first lockdown are not to be replicated. And I think that is directed actually at mental health support. And just, sorry, in terms of your question on the balance, I had to just step in briefly. If it's the case that we can get a virus to the market in the first quarter of 2021, no one would deny this has been an exceptionally difficult a vaccine to the market. No one would deny this has been an exceptionally challenging year, but in terms of striking a balance, I would say it's been struck correctly.
Well, I mean, I'm going to give some other figures, Madeline, because going beyond children, 68% rise in suicides and attempted suicides compared to last year. That's from the London Ambulance Service. A 58% increase in psychiatric emergencies in September compared to last year from the Royal College of Psychiatrists. We are now in another lockdown. Is it a price worth paying in terms of people's well-being to be locked down again?
Well, I think that I don't think the right balance has been struck. I mean, to an extent, figuring out how you manage these things is a calculation on when you think that you'll be able to get yourself out of lockdown. And there's various gambles taking place on all sides. But I think, for example, just to take the last national lockdown measures that came in, I mean, there were so many examples of things that the government decided to ban or hinder from taking place that are so clearly good for people's mental well-being, such as banning even sports like golf, tennis, outdoor swimming, that can be innately socially distanced, and would probably, the risk of transmission of continuing with these sports would be absolutely minimal. So the fact that they've decided to continue with these things, despite the fact, despite the minimal impact on transmission, suggests that there's an awful lot of kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater going on.
Right.
And I think that, sorry, Joe.
No, go on. You finish your point.
I just think that the innate truth about lockdown, we sometimes forget just how abnormal the new normal is. It seems that you couldn't create a situation that would better entrench just about every negative thought process, every obsessive behaviour, every kind of disordered way of thinking, when you force people to stay inside, deprive them of all the usual external stimuli that would keep them occupied, deprive them of companionship. I mean, it's even if we had, I think we've severely neglected mental health for some time in this country, but even if we had the best funded, best equipped system in the world, forcing a nation to do that, to live like that for months, I mean, how could it not create this terrible ticking time bomb that we have on our doorstep?
Helen?
I mean, I think the way to think about lockdowns is that they're an emergency brake, and you have to pull the emergency brake when all the other measures have failed and you need to get cases down. So having to go into a second lockdown was undoubtedly something that the government felt that it simply had to do. But I think exactly as Madeline has said, let's be realistic about the downsides that brings along with it, as well as the upside of hopefully controlling cases. And also, when we're putting all this money in to support the economy, putting money in to support people, we talked a lot about children, rightly so, and I think keeping the schools open as a priority is the right one. But, what's happening in care homes and to older people, I think, is equally alarming. And there is a sort of sense, well, they're old, people in their 90s, they haven't got long left. So, what does it matter if they can't have any visitors? And I think that's an awful and appalling attitude to have. And that the focus should be on that kind of thing as well.
I mean, are people really appreciating, though, people who are suffering with maybe mental health problems normally in their life that's exacerbated by the lockdown massively? I mean, Madeline, you wrote about this with your own personal experience at the weekend.
Yes. I mean, I suffered from anorexia for several years as a teenager, and I thought I was very much over it. I thought it was something that I left behind 10 years ago. But then under lockdown, I found myself, I mean, not too bad a relapse, but I found myself really having to work hard to resist the temptation to slip back into negative habits. And since I wrote my piece about that, I've had so many messages from people who've said, I thought that my anxiety issues were behind me. I thought that X, Y, and Z was a distant memory. And I'm finding that confined to my home, it's all coming back again. And I just think that, it goes back to the point of what lockdown does. It strips a innately social species of just about every mechanism we have for dealing with problems. We normally deal with problems collectively. We deal with them by distracting ourselves. For me, getting over my eating disorder, it was crucial to get out of my own distorted way of thinking. But how on earth can you do that when many people are, they've been banned from working, essentially, by the government. They've had their organic social interactions replaced with social media, which is unhealthy in itself. I think we really need to work harder to strike the right balance. And I think aside from the care homes issue that Helen quite rightly raises, I think what the government is doing to kids at universities right now is incredibly worrying. They've kind of created a worst of all possible worlds situation where you take young people at a particularly kind of transitional and possibly vulnerable time in their lives. You take them away from their family networks, but then instead of offering the usual socialising that makes that transition bearable, many have simply been confined to their homes with often inadequate pastoral care. So I think that's another issue that requires urgent attention.
Laura?
I don't disagree with anything that either Madeline or Helen said about us being social creatures and the risk of some of, kind of feelings that have long been suppressed coming up to the surface. I think the government would readily concede that this is an emergency and drastic measure and completely counterintuitive to the way that we would wish to live. But it is an emergency measure. In terms of care homes, guidance was published at the end of last week, and I hope that this is now sufficiently clear that there is now provision for people in care homes to have a visitor or two even, actually, in exceptional circumstances, and that can all be found on the Gov UK website. On the subject of students...
Laura, if I might come in, I just think you have to acknowledge that there has been a policy failure here, which is if we're going to have in this emergency situation, it's partly because of the evidence suggests eat out to help out, which increased cases by between 8 and 18%, according to research, and the government's encouragement for people to go on holiday. There was an ending of the press conferences. What happened over the summer was kind of, thank goodness we've got cases down. And everybody knew that winter coming back, people being forced inside, universities coming back, schools coming back, would drive it back up again. So, this is what I mean about the emergency brake. Yes, right to pull the emergency brake, but why was the train speeding towards the blocked tunnel in the first place?
Well, I think actually, if I just come back on Eat Out to Help Out, some of the highest take-up of that was in the south of England, particularly in my part of the world, the constituency I represent, the southeast and the southwest, and yet we stayed really, really low on the virus and have one of the lowest rates of the virus.
Although the rates of increase were beginning to pick up.
They were beginning to, but we're well out of the Eat Out to Help Out. We're now in November, and in fact we were at the end of October when the decision was taken. So I think I don't accept that there's necessarily a linear correlation, but look, I do think that I think that was really important to have a clear policy in place on care homes. I totally accept the argument that people were left in heartbreaking situations, waving through windows to loved ones. We all saw those images, and I strongly welcome the new policy that lets people see the people that they love who are in care homes.
I mean, a number of your Conservative colleagues, of course, are very unhappy about another lockdown. If there was an attempt to extend it beyond December the 2nd, would the government count on your support?
The government have been, the Prime Minister's been very clear that we're going back to the tier system on the 2nd of December. And certainly from my part of the world, I would strongly support that because we were tier 1 at the point when we went in.
All right. And just to tell everyone that if you are suffering or you know someone who is suffering with mental health issues, please go to the BBC Action Line pages of the BBC website where there are content details of organisations that can help. That's bbc.co.uk/action line. Now, we've been talking a bit about lockdown. Well, the firebreak in Wales has ended today, and the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, has been giving a press conference and has talked about the vaccine. Let's listen to him.
It is good news, of course, if any of the vaccines in trial are making progress. I think you'd always want to read carefully what a particular competitor in this field says on their own behalf. And I'm not going to be tempted today, Dan, as I've tried not to be tempted throughout coronavirus, to suggest that this somehow means that there is a magic bullet on the horizon and coronavirus is about to disappear out of our lives.
First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford. Let's talk to Thomas Morgan, our correspondent in Cardiff. Thomas, what happens now in Wales? Does life return to relative normality?
Yeah, some sort of normality. It feels a little bit like it was kind of when we started seeing those big easing processes after the first lockdown earlier this year. If you remember, just before this firebreak, around 2/3 of Wales were under local lockdown restrictions, which meant that nobody should be leaving their local authority area without good reason, and that was kind of banned by law. So now everything's reopened, the shops have reopened, bars and restaurants, cafes reopened, leisure facilities, gyms have reopened, and people now can travel within Wales. However, it is banned to leave the country, to go on holiday, to go into England, and it's also banned for people from England, from lockdown areas, to be coming into Wales, the only exception being work, care or school, really. So there are certain restrictions in place. So the one impact that the English lockdown does have on Wales is tourism, really. I've spoken to a few tourism businesses that actually are not opening certain aspects of their business because they get so much profit from people coming in from the other side of the border that they just don't feel they can reopen, even though we've come out of the firebreak here in Wales. But no doubt there is a certain sense of, well, going back to some sort of normality here. But as I say, there are certain restrictions in place. One of the big differences, though, is that the Welsh Government say they have been listening to youngsters and to people living alone. So they said that people from 4 different households can meet up in hospitality venues or for a walk, but they will have to socially distance and give IDs if they do that.
Thomas and Cardiff, thank you very much. Let's get some more reaction on the news of the vaccine from Donald Trump, no less, who has tweeted, stock market up big, all in capital letters, of course. Vaccine coming soon, report 90% effective. Such great news. I think we can bring you another tweet, this from one of our BBC correspondents, also talking about the markets. Biden bounce from Darshini David, overtaken weekend by the Hope Rally. FTSE 100 up 5%, S&P futures soaring as Pfizer results give potential lifeline to lives and livelihoods. Ian, do you think this is going to change the mood?
Well, I hope it changes the mood, but I hope it doesn't change it too much, because people should still abide by the rules that are there, and let's not get too excited. I think Mark Drakeford's right to say this isn't a silver bullet as yet, but obviously people are looking at this positively, and I think the fact that the markets there have said that, you know, they're up because this is about the economy, it's about lives and it's about livelihoods. So I think people might rest a little bit easier tonight if they're worried about their jobs and about the future, but 90% is not quite there yet. Let's just wait and see what happens. I feel as if I'm on CNN talking about the US election results, but we can't get too excited.
We haven't got the wall behind you.
Yes, we need the vaccine, because in advance of the vaccine, the only way we're going to get out of this is a proper test and trace and isolate system, which we don't currently have, and therefore the vaccine may be the silver bullet, but we're not there yet.
All right, well, that is the breaking news today on the programme, but it's all we've got time for. We'll bring you more on the vaccine tomorrow, and I'll be back with the show tomorrow at 12:15 from all of us here. Bye-bye.
Young people are our capital.